Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series about Russia's time of troubles. In Part 1, Death Takes the Crown, we will talk about how Ivan the Terrible plunged Russia into a catastrophic dynastic crisis, one made much worse by a disastrous famine. Ivan the Terrible transformed Russia during his 40-year reign, achieving extraordinary things but marring his legacy with episodic outbreaks of terrible rage and perhaps madness. The most infamous of these eruptions occurred around the night of November 16, 1581, when the Tsar assaulted his daughter-in-law, who he felt wore unconventionally light and revealing clothing. When the younger Ivan rushed in and confronted his father, the elder Ivan struck him upon the head with his scepter. Ivan the Younger died on November 19, 1581. His father sank into crushing melancholy, sometimes consoling himself with the knowledge that God had sacrificed his only son as well. Yet he also commanded that the names of all those murdered during his reign be written down and prayed for. He wandered through the palace, talking to himself and wailing for his lost son. In 1584, Tsar Ivan the Terrible collapsed during a chess game and died only hours later, probably from a stroke. Two of his other sons survived. Fyodor had become a handicapped weakling, and an infant named Dmitri also survived his terrible father. Since Ivan had Dmitri with his second wife, and Orthodox law only recognized 3 wives for a man, young Dmitri had no official place in the line of succession. Nonetheless, the name Dmitri would become terribly important in years to come. In the meantime, Fyodor became the new Tsar. He spent most of his waking hours in monotonous prayer and took a special delight in the ringing of church bells, which earned him the nickname Fyodor Bellringer. Yet Tsar Fyodor knew nothing of the terrible problems that his father left Russia. Ivan had waged brutal war against both the Swedes and the Poles, yet did not achieve enough success to justify his country's sacrifices. Meanwhile, the boyars saw their estates plundered and their families murdered by Ivan's terrifying oprichniki, black-robed riders who mounted a severed dog's head on the pommel of their saddles to show they would sniff out and devour the Tsar's enemies. Even the lesser gentry who bought boyar estates seized by the oprichniki faced a crisis caused by peasants fleeing debt and tyranny. During Fyodor's reign, the lesser nobility rallied under a semi-literate Tartar named Boris Godunov, who married his sister to Tsar Fyodor. He used this royal connection to thwart the efforts of the old boyar families to reclaim power. Yet suddenly, word came that young Prince Dmitri had died while under guard by Boris Godunov's men. Officials hand-picked by Godunov determined that the 10-year-old Dmitri suffered an epileptic episode while playing with a knife, and during the seizure, Dmitri accidentally killed himself. No real evidence connected Godunov to the murder, but many suspected that Boris had not only cleared himself with a sham investigation, but arranged for the convenient death of Prince Dmitri. Not long after, Tsar Fyodor died at the age of 30 without producing an heir. Acting quickly, Boris Godunov gathered an assembly to elect him the new Tsar. This marked the end of the 600-year dynasty founded by the Viking prince Rurik. First, Tsar Boris removed members of the old dynasty from power. He forced Fyodor Romanov, a nephew of Anastasia, the beloved first wife of Ivan the Terrible, to become a monk named Brother Filaret. That name will also become very important. Boris Godunov desperately hoped to bring Western modernity to his backwards nation. He tried to found a university in Moscow, but the Orthodox Church condemned it as foreign contamination. Afterwards, he sent several young Russians to study abroad, but they disappeared from the pages of history. However, Boris Godunov faced a far more dangerous challenge in 1601, when the Huye Naputuna eruption in South America triggered Europe's most devastating famine of that hungry era. Beginning in 1601, Russia endured 3 years of crop failure. Already on the northern tier of European agriculture, peasants often had few reserves to ride out hungry months. Tsar Boris Godunov made desperate attempts to collect and distribute food to famine-stricken areas. Yet it did no good, in part because Russians blamed the usurper Godunov for bringing about the famine to start with. Had Boris not offended God by stealing the throne and probably murdering Dmitri, the heir of Ivan the Terrible? Desperate Russians turned to eating hay and grass. People lay stiffened in the snow, their mouths still stuffed with hay and teeth stained green by grass. Some families murdered and ate their own children if they did not have enough food to endure the next winter. Other villages set up cannibal canteens where they served strangers they waylaid and murdered. Some sensational accounts even told of bakers selling pies stuffed with human flesh in the market stalls of Moscow. Cannibal chefs would have had much to choose from. Around the wooden walls of the Russian capital, Moscow, survivors threw 127,000 half-frozen corpses into ditches, more than half the city's population. As people grew desperate, armed mobs began sweeping through central Russia. The Russian peasants saw wealth as intrinsically sinful, a sign of corrupt character that could only be earned by squeezing, taxing, and cheating hard-working peasants. Mobs invaded the houses of Russian boyars, embarking on wholesale looting, hauling out cheese wheels, grain reserves, and cured meats. When Tsar Boris Godunov sent the army in to suppress them, the peasants did battle with Tsarist forces and sometimes won. Yet the looting could never feed men for very long. Russia, a country of almost 6 million people, saw more than 1 million people starve to death over those 2 terrible years of famine. And Russia's time of troubles was far from over. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.